The big questions continue to mount for the New Orleans Saints as the offseason gets closer and closer, but one of the biggest is going to be what to do with wide receiver Michael Thomas. We're breaking down all the options. We got all that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Saints, your daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks so much, as always, making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget, we're free and available on all podcast apps and on YouTube as well. And I'm your host, Ross Jackson, at Ross Jackson Nola on Twitter, your New Orleans Saints expert, credential member of the media, CrescentCitySports.com, USA Today Saints Wire, Tuesdays on Locked On NFL, and here with you every single Monday through Friday and then some on Locked On Saints. Today's episode brought to you by our friends over at Bet Online. They've got more odds, lines, props than ever before. Make sure you go and check them out today. Bet Online, where the game starts. I started recording this without changing anything over on the On Today's Show graphic, and I'm making a decision live on whether or not I'm going to keep it or change it. I think I'm going to change it. There you go. It's changed. All right. Y'all just pretend like nothing ever happened. Nothing ever happened. We're just going to keep rolling on. On today's episode, we're answering some of the big questions for the New Orleans Saints as we do in our future episodes every Wednesday. And today we're answering three big questions. Should the New Orleans Saints bring Marcus Davenport back? We'll discuss that decision. Will Dennis Allen be back in 2023? We'll discuss why that's likely. And we'll also take a look at what the options are for Michael Thomas. That's where we're going to start off today, though, is with Michael Thomas, because Michael Thomas has had a rough couple of years. The Saints have had a rough couple of years around that whole situation as well. Michael Thomas, though, dealing with these injuries, man. He had the ankle injury, the surgery, the tightrope procedure that went wrong, had to get another surgery. The first surgery had kind of gotten put off because he had gotten a second opinion from somebody that said, hey, fam, you're good. You don't need surgery. You can rehab this. Couldn't. And then all of a sudden he gets a different injury over the course of this year. This was what was it called? A dislocated second toe. So look at your big toe right quick. Take a second. Not if you're driving. Imagine your big toe if you're driving. And then go one toe over. It's like your index toe. That one basically. Ended up getting dislocated. Their options were either shut him down for the season and give him surgery, or try to rehab it. And then if the rehab doesn't work, shut him down and get him surgery. So I think the Saints made the right call there. Might as well try to save his season as opposed to just saying, all right, well, you're done for the season off of that injury, right? And I'm sure, Michael Thomas probably felt the same way. So will he be back in a New Orleans Saints uniform in 2023 week 1? That's a big question that the New Orleans Saints are going to have to answer. There's a couple of things that they can do to kind of help navigate this situation, though, because a part of what might keep him in New Orleans is simply his contract. I mean, they paid him a ton of money. Then he goes out there, he breaks the receiving record that very first year on that contract. Then all of this injury stuff starts to happen, right? And so do you go to him and say, all right, your contract is what your contract is. We want to keep you here in New Orleans, but we're going to restructure it, kick the can down the road some more? Or do you get a little bit more fancy? And you can get a little bit more fancy by, instead of restructuring the contract, actually renegotiating the contract with him. We've seen this happen with guys like Drew Brees and Malcolm Jenkins are the two easiest examples, right? Because right before they retired, they went in and they didn't just restructure their contract. They didn't take their base salary, reduce it all, convert some of it into a signing bonus and push the money down the road. They reduced their base salary from where it was to veteran minimum to save the Saints some money and then make it easier on the books when they retired. You could do something similar to that. You don't have to reduce it all the way to vet minimum. That's just what they did because they were on their way out the door. But, Malcolm Jenkins did that quietly, like weeks before he ever announced his retirement. And there were some of us that were kind of watching that and be like, he about to retire. Like, that's a retirement move. So we're not talking about him reducing his, base salary all the way down to veteran minimum or anything like that. But, does he take some amount of money off the top of his contract to make sure that the Saints then say, and why would the Saints do this? The Saints would do this because they're basically like, okay, well, look, paid you a bunch of money. You've already been paid a bunch of money. didn't really get much out of you over the course of the last 3 years because of the injuries and so on and so forth. So take the reduction now. And then it's just moving the money from one spot to the other, basically. So he's got a base salary next year of $15.5 million, a base salary in 2024 of $18.5 million, right? So if you take that $15.5 million and chop $5 million off the top of it, you save $5 million as an organization. You then get a renegotiated contract with him. If you take another $5 million off the top of, let's say, next year, you're saving $10 million. You're saving another $5 million back in 2024. Then you can restructure the contract and kick the can down the road and do all the fun stuff that you love to do if you're the New Orleans Saints. But there are some ways for you to be able to do that. Now, I'm just making up numbers in terms of how much to cut off the top of the contract. You could cut this contract in half. You could cut this contract. It just kind of depends on what the New Orleans Saints feel they've gotten from Michael Thomas, what they feel they can get from him in 2023, and what Michael Thomas and his representation are willing to accept. Like, that actually has to be an active negotiation, as opposed to just going to him and saying, hey, fam, we're restructuring your contract. Enjoy the bonus checks that are going to start coming in the next couple of weeks. Like, it's going to be a little bit different. So it would take a little bit of conversation and all that. And then the other thing that they could do, if they don't feel the need to keep him, and they want to trade him, or maybe he wants to go elsewhere, whatever that situation might be, because everything's a two-way street, they could also go to him and say, okay, let's renegotiate the contract, which makes it easier for us to trade you where you want to go. And then they can kind of work together on making sure that he ends up with a team that he wants to go to that might offer him a new contract. They can work together on reducing that salary so that they can more easily move him. And then the condition of the trade could be, all right, trading you to the, let's say, Los Angeles Rams, just because this feels like something the Los Angeles Rams would do, contingent upon him getting a new deal, right? Like, he could tell them, I'm cool with this trade, but you have to give me a new contract when I get there. And they can kind of iron all of those details out before the move gets made, before the trade actually happens and all that. And then you make that trade a post-June 1 trade designation that cuts some of the salary that maybe might accelerate in terms of the dead money that would accelerate. Then you can go ahead and help yourself out like that as well. So there are options for the New Orleans Saints, whether they want to keep Michael Thomas around on his deal, but kick the can down the road, whether they want to keep Michael Thomas around, but reduce his contract to better reflect what they've gotten from him over the course of the past 3 years because of injury, knowing that they've been paying him that whole while, but then now want to recoup some of that money on the back end after they've already cut him bigger checks than what they've gotten in terms of the on-field production, because he's been unavailable. There's an option there. And then the other option, if they want to trade him, or if he wants to be traded, is to reduce the salary, which would help them find the trade partner, get him somewhere he wants to go, potentially even get him a new contract somewhere else in the meanwhile. So they can actually go and renegotiate their deal as long as both sides agree on what that is. Now, it's not just a negotiation with Michael Thomas. It's with his representation. It's with, and the team. So it's more than just what Michael Thomas wants, doesn't want, will accept, won't accept. It's bigger than that. So they have to figure all of that out. But there are options in terms of what to do with Michael Thomas. If it's me, I go to him. I see if he's willing to renegotiate his contract. If he's not willing to renegotiate his contract, I'm restructuring him and I'm keeping him in New Orleans. Like, I'm giving that another run. But I'm pushing to restructure to renegotiate the contract. And if he says, I'll renegotiate the contract only if you trade me, then that might have to be the route that you go. And then you trade him, you recoup some picks, and then you work on getting younger at wide receiver. You try to find that next guy, whatever that might be. And thankfully, you've already got Chris Olave in the building. So it kind of becomes for Michael Thomas what Michael Thomas was for Brandon Cooks, in that, like, hey, there's a guy for us to rely on. We want you to be a part of this, but if you don't feel like you want to be or can't be, whatever it might be, that's okay. We can send you somewhere where you're comfortable, and then you can renegotiate the contract and get that done. But if it's me, I'm trying everything that I can to renegotiate that contract and get him to stay in New Orleans. But that's a favor. That's a favor. But if you're able to help him see, like, you got paid already, now we want to just pay you a little bit less because, the injuries and all those other things, then maybe the logic of that always works through. So who's going to be the driving force behind a conversation like that? Well, it could be Dennis Allen. Look, Michael Thomas and Dennis Allen have a great relationship. They really, really do. Dennis Allen's the guy that got him back on board, along with guys like Cody Burns and everything else. But will Dennis Allen be back in 2023? Let me tell you why that's likely. We're going to break that down as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. All right. Today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by our friends over at LinkedIn. If you're somebody that's looking for a job, you always go to LinkedIn. So if you're somebody that's looking to hire, you should be going to LinkedIn as well, because you make sure that you're getting 100% certainty that you have the best qualified candidates that you're going to be able to find that are available, because that's what LinkedIn do. They give you the best qualified candidates. That's why you got to check out LinkedIn Jobs today, because LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the right people faster and for free to help them join your team. You can put that purple hiring frame, hashtag hiring frame, to help spread the word when you are hiring. You get screening questions and other simple tools to make sure that you're getting the right qualifications and experience and even culture fits that you're looking for before you even make the decision on whether or not you'd like to interview them. That's why small businesses have rated LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality candidates versus the leading competitors that are out there. Don't mess around with the leading competitors. Go and check out LinkedIn Jobs, because LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Today's episode also brought to you by Audible and their new slate of football podcasts that we just know that you're going to love, which is why you can actually find a sneak peek of the Think Like a Champion podcast available right now as a bonus episode on Locked On Presents. Think Like a Champion is a brand new podcast from NFL quarterback Russell Wilson and Audible. These guys are champions on the field, off the field, but sometimes we miss a little bit about what goes into understanding like the grind and that path to getting to greatness. That's why Russell Wilson and his co-hosts dig into high performance athletes, artists, as well as leaders who are always pushing the boundaries of their potential. Guys like Super Bowl champion and MVP Von Miller, who talks about delivering his like sharp insights into digging into performing at your highest level in moments that bring the most extreme pressure. Tim Tebow discusses how you find your unique personal mission in the world. You've got Olympic gold medalists, really all across, honestly, medalists from the Olympics. You've got NFL stars, business leaders, all sharing their stories and bringing you all of that, all of those mental techniques that they use that have gotten them into becoming some of the world's most elite performers across the finish line and beyond. So head over to Locked On Presents today to get a sneak peek of the Think Like a Champion podcast, or you can catch the full series available wherever you get your podcasts, available everywhere now. Audible, get in the game. All right, family, continuing on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. There are a lot of possibilities for the New Orleans Saints over the course of this offseason. We've discussed some. We'll continue to discuss more, particularly at head coach. But what's the most likely scenario for the New Orleans Saints over the course of this offseason? It's very likely that Dennis Allen maintains his role at head coach in 2023. I'll tell you why that's not something that you shouldn't be surprised by. Let me say it that way. We're going to break that down as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. Appreciate you as always making us your first listen of the day every day. And of course, make sure you go and check out Locked On Sports today as well, bringing you everything you need to know around the world of sports, around 20 to 25 minutes. You can find it on the Odyssey app, YouTube, wherever you get your podcast. Okay, so there's a whole lot of conversation around the New Orleans Saints head coaching position. The Saints could be interested in a Sean Payton return. Reports are saying if Sean Payton is interested in that return, the Saints could go outside and try to find a whole new look, which is kind of where I am. I'm all about like going out and saying, okay, evolve with the NFL, change with the NFL. Go and figure out like what else is out there, what other directions you can go in, all of that. But what's the most likely scenario, for being honest? The most likely scenario, honestly, is that Dennis Allen remains the head coach going into 2023. And I know a lot of people are going to moan and groan about that. And I understand, like you're warranted in judging Dennis Allen and the New Orleans Saints head coach based on this year's performance. You're 100% warranted in that. But for the New Orleans Saints, they might see it as reactionary on their end to kind of do the one and done thing. Remember, there's reputations, there's all this other stuff that you kind of have to watch out for in the NFL. And moving on from a coach after 1 year, especially one that has dedicated so much time in his career to you and to your organization, that leaves a little bit of a stain on the organization, makes it tough for you to go out there and find the right head coach, the next head coach, meaningful, viable hires beyond that, stuff like that. It's one of the reasons why I continuously said, hey, I get it. It's not working with Dennis Allen right now, but they're not going to fire him in the middle of the season. They can't do that. they'll never be able to hire any other head coach ever again if they went that route. And so they could extend that line of thinking into abandoning too quickly in the second year. So what else do you do, right? Because clearly this isn't working, right? And let me tell you something. I'm not advocating one way or another. I'm just preparing you for a possibility here when we discuss this. Like, I'm not advocating for one thing or another, but I do think that if you maintain Dennis Allen moving into 2023, you got to make changes on the staff elsewhere. I was concerned about co-defensive coordinator. I think that should just be a one-person job. What we've seen so far this year, there's not really a lot that like bends back to the co-defensive coordinators in Chris Richard and Ryan Nielsen. The tackling issues, things like that, some of the like lane discipline issues, stuff like that. That could be around that, but those guys are also the defensive line coaches. They're also the secondary coaches. But I could see the value in going back to a single mind and a single leader in terms of who the defensive coordinator is, whether it's one of those guys and one of them gets another job elsewhere. Ryan Nielsen should be a hot, defensive coordinator candidate out in college, out in the NFL as well. He's been getting interest for years and years and years and years, as is Chris Richard. So one of those guys, if not both of those guys, potentially could get jobs elsewhere and see it as an opportunity to be the lone guy running their defense, as opposed to sort of this co-defensive coordinator thing. It was something I was a little bit kind of concerned about, but I haven't seen any real loudly telltale signs that it's been an issue. But I think when you look at some of where they've struggled on defense, which everything else is kind of consistent, right? Except for the two safeties, you have to look at what did change. And that's one of the things that did change. They went from a single co-defensive coordinator or a single defensive coordinator to effectively having three defensive coordinators, because you had Chris Richard, Ryan Nielsen as your co-defensive coordinators, but then Dennis Allen's calling defensive plays. It's a lot of space there for communication to be jumbled and things like that. So we'll see if they feel that same way. That's a place where they could make a change, or I could be completely wrong and they could be like, no, actually that was never an issue, so we're cool rolling through there. But I'm hard pressed to believe that one of those guys isn't going to get an opportunity to run their own defense somewhere else in 2023. So I think the shift back to a single defensive coordinator is likely. We don't see co-defensive coordinators really, or co-coordinators really work or last long in the NFL at all. It's more of a collegiate thing. Offensive coordinator is a place where I think no matter what, I've always expected there was going to be a change going into 2023. Pete Carmichael didn't want the job at one point, reports had said, and then all of a sudden he had the job. He became the full-time play caller, all of that. And it hasn't worked. Like, let's just be real. Like, he hasn't impressed as the full-time play caller. They've struggled to get Alvin Kamara involved in the passing game. They're making weird decisions, like taking their best players off the field in pivotal moments. They're struggling to, you look at the run game in Philadelphia, for instance, you look at the run game in Atlanta even, it is so much more, there's so many more moving pieces than what the New Orleans Saints have when it comes to their run game. And that comes down to motion, pulling guards, doing things, interesting things in terms of a mix of inside, outside zones, running Alvin Kamara between the tackles more than you're running Alvin Kamara on the outside, those types of things. Like, those are just kind of curious decisions that are being made. So I think like that evidence is certainly there, but again, I'll use the phrase hard pressed. You would have had me, I'm hard pressed to believe early on in the season, even that Pete Carmichael would have been back in 2023, because it didn't feel like that was really the thing. Kind of felt like it was like looking ahead to, all right, Ronald Curry needs one more year, right? So we'll see. I don't know if it's going to be Ronald Curry, if it's going to be somewhere else, another outside hire, something like that. Maybe that's where, a guy like a Frank Reich comes in or something, if he doesn't find another head coaching position somewhere, to where all of a sudden it's like, oh, it's like that. Like, you end up having this big thing. And look, I mean, we've seen some surprising coaching hires elsewhere, like Mike Zimmer just became the defensive coordinator in Colorado because Deion's pulling him strings. You know what I mean? So like, there's always those guys that can surprise and become available or be available when you don't think they are and stuff like that. So I think that, just as we're continuing to explore all of the different possibilities that could happen at head coach, it's worth not losing sight of what's most likely. And what's most likely is that Dennis Allen is back in 2023, but there are big changes on the coaching staff elsewhere and hopefully a new direction for the offense. Like, you can't run the Sean Payton system without Sean Payton. We know it now. And let me take that a step further. You can't run the Sean Payton system without Sean Payton and Drew Brees, right? Like, you don't have either of those guys. And so you have to change. You have to do something on your own. You have to bring in a new philosophy, a new direction, all of that. And I think you can do that by making adjustments at coordinator on the offensive side, and then focusing down on one coordinator on the defensive side, maybe even getting a defensive play caller so that Dennis Allen's role becomes more of the head coach as opposed to the sharing a third of the defensive coordinator role. Then all of a sudden things might take steps forward, might improve. But that's on the New Orleans Saints for making that decision, and then they'll need to be judged on that moving forward. Then maybe if that doesn't work, then you start asking questions about higher up beyond that. And then we'll see what happens there. So the New Orleans Saints, big questions to answer over the course of the offseason. Michael Thomas, Dennis Allen, but it doesn't stop there. Over on the defensive side, they got a big question to answer too. Should they be bringing back Marcus Davenport this offseason? We're going to break that down as we continue on and wrap up today's episode of Locked On Saints. Today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by Bet Online, our number one source for all of our sports wagering information. Every line, every odd, every prop, everything that you hear here on the Locked On Podcast Network is a Bet Online odd, because they're super dope. They are the most trusted source when it comes to everything, when it comes to betting, and they're the only ones that we trust. They're the only ones that we'll recommend to you as well. They've got everything for you from basketball to football to the college bowl season on the way, World Cup they've even got as well. You can find all of it over at betonline.net. It's your number one source for sports betting info, stats, news, analysis, and I know you like sports podcasts. They have those as well over at Bet Online. They're always getting you the fastest and easiest way to get your bet info. So head over to their website today or use your mobile device to learn more. Bet Online, where the game starts. Let's get it. Who Dat Nation, wrapping up today's episode of Locked On Saints with one more big question for the New Orleans Saints offseason. That's what these Wednesday afternoon episodes are all going to be dedicated to, answering some of the biggest questions for the New Orleans Saints. So we discussed kind of the future of Michael Thomas and what the options are there, how the New Orleans Saints can keep him as is, how the New Orleans Saints can keep him but make some adjustments, and how the New Orleans Saints can even adjust and trade him. We discussed the most likely scenario at 2023 head coach with Dennis Allen, but what changes would need to be made around there. And by the way, some folks have mentioned to me before, and I guess I didn't lay this out, but some people had mentioned to me before when I was discussing like the draft pick of Hendon Hooker, for instance, that the Saints would need to make changes on the offensive staff in order to get that done. Yeah. Right. Anyway, so as we look here, we'll go to Marcus Davenport. Should the New Orleans Saints bring Marcus Davenport back? They picked up his fifth-year option for this year. That's why he was still on the roster here. He was drafted in the 2018 season. And so what would have been the final year of his initial rookie deal would have been last year, but they had picked up that fifth-year option for this year. And so now as he plays his contract out, I think it's fair to say at this point, with 4 games left, he will have underwhelmed not only his draft position, which was a early first-round selection, but also the cost of the trade. If I looked at you and said, okay, was Chris Olave's first year worth the investment that the Saints made in him? I think you have every reason to say yes. Like, unless you're, a Green Bay Packers fan and you're mad that your team didn't invest in wide receivers the way they should have, Peter Bukowski, or I'm messing with you, or but outside of that, you look at it and you say, okay, yeah, it was worth it, because some of the investment was around Chris Olave, other parts of the investment were around Trevor Penning. And so when you look at Marcus Davenport, it's clear that he hasn't really lived up to what the potential should have been for his draft position. Drafted 14th overall in 2018. And so far he sits with 21 and a half total sacks, and he's got a half sack this year. The best season. And yes, you heard that right. He has 1 half sack so far this season. The best season he's put together so far was in 2021, last year, where he had 9 sacks, where it felt like things clicked, right? Final year of his rookie deal, outside of the 5th-year option, like, all right, 9 sacks, only appeared in 11 games that season, has appeared in 11 games this season, only has a half sack. So he hasn't really been able to follow up on all that. And not only does he only have a half sack, but he's also got a career low in tackles for a loss right now, which is 2. He's got a career low so far in quarterback hits, which is currently 7. And right now he sits with his third lowest tackling total in terms of his total tackling total at 24. So what we've seen from him so far is not that of a player that you would usually extend, right? Not to a big deal, right? And that is the next piece of all of this, is that if you do extend him, like, what does his market value really look like going into next year? And the way that that Spot Rack looks at it is that they have, and I remember this was set probably before the season, and this has just kind of lived here on the website for a long time, so they probably haven't adjusted for his actual output for this year. But they have him in the same class as guys like Myles Garrett, DeMarcus Lawrence, Leonard Williams, and Frank Clark. Let me tell you right now, Spot Rack, that ain't happening. Right now, they've got him set up at a 4-year deal at $23.2 million per year, $93 million in total. Put him 21st in the NFL, second amongst defensive ends. That ain't what he's getting. He's not going to be paid right behind Myles Garrett. And so this is where I think the question about what to do with Marcus Davenport has its caveat. I think you let Marcus Davenport test the market. I think you let him test the market. He's a guy that plays a premium position, a premier position in the NFL, one of the most important positions in the NFL, arguably the second most important position in the NFL, depending upon how you feel about the blindside blocker. Which isn't always the left tackle, right? Sometimes you got a left-handed quarterback, like in Miami. I think you let him test the market. If he gets a big deal somewhere, let him have the big deal somewhere, right? The Trey Hendrickson effect, right? You let him go. You let him test out the market. If he gets a big deal, he gets a big deal. You return a compensatory pick for it. And really, based upon what you've gotten for him, I mean, a lot of folks talked about trading him over the course of the offseason. I also mentioned that. You probably talked about getting a day 3 pick, or day 2, like a round 3 pick at most for him anyway. If he goes out there and he gets a big deal, then in 2024 you get that 3rd round pick anyway. You delay it a year, which kind of stinks, but it's a part of what you can do. If he doesn't get the big deal somewhere, then you keep in touch with him and you make him your offer and you say, okay, well, this is our offer, but go and see if you can find a bigger offer somewhere else. And then if he doesn't find a bigger offer, then he comes back on something that makes sense for the team, a 2-year something or another. You know what I mean? You have to, you're not going to be able to get away with what you did with like a Tano Pass, 2 years, $4.5 million. It's not going to be that team friendly. But you know what I mean? You bring him back on something that makes sense for the team, depending upon where they are with their salary cap, or you don't. Like, that's the other option here. Like, I'm kind of playing it like, okay, here's the option in terms of keeping him. Here's the option of like letting him sort of make the decision for you. But there's also the option that you just simply don't. And I wouldn't blame the New Orleans Saints for doing that, especially if they feel like they can find young players at that position in the draft. If they feel like they can find, another player to kind of help supplement that position when it comes to free agency. There's a lot of different routes that they can go that don't require them to break the bank for somebody that isn't unproven, but sort of has actually proven to you exactly who he is. And I don't think that that's worth investing in at this time. So when you look at like some of the defensive ends that are going to be available over the course of the offseason, guys like Yannick Ngakoue will hit the market. Guys like Larry Ogunjobi will hit the market. Guys like Samson Ekubom will hit the market. So there will be players that could hit the market that are around his talent level and around his age even. And you can also go and lean on some of the older veterans too if you need a bandage for a little while. Guys like Jordan Phillips, guys like Justin Houston, guys like, you could probably maybe potentially go out and grab a guy like Arden Key, bring him back to Louisiana, Carlos Dunlap. Like, there are players that or not Carlos Dunlap, sorry, I saw his name, but I meant the guy I actually wanted to point out was Dante Fowler Jr., because I feel like also the other thing that could change in New Orleans is the prototype at defensive end and at edge rusher. Are the big towering defensive ends that, just focus on power, well, not just focus on power, but that kind of like live and die by their power moves, is that really what's most conducive in an NFL that's getting more and more athletic at quarterback? Or do you need to counteract that by being athletic on the edge as well? So guys like Dante Fowler and some of the other names that I read are also, a bit of a change in prototype, which I don't think is a bad thing. We highlighted a couple of players in the mock draft that we did in yesterday's episode on Tuesday, like Jared Verse out of Florida State University, as well as Texas Tech's Tyree Wilson, that change that have a little bit of both, that are these big towering guys, but that can play the power role, speed to power conversion role, but that can also play the athletic, get around the edge, bend the corner type role at defensive end as well. And so you get those guys that, are already polished, that already have a second move, that already have a pass rushing game plan, that already feel like they are at NFL strength and have the ability to add more onto their frame, like you've done with Carl Granderson, like you've done with Marcus Davenport in the past. But you don't have to develop them as much as you've had to develop them as kind of raw project players like Marcus Davenport and Peyton Turner. You end up finding players that are a little bit more polished. So I think, honestly, like that's a route that I could see them going over the course of the offseason. I see a lot of changes in direction coming this offseason that would make a lot of sense. I don't think that this is a team that's going to be able to convince itself that the status quo makes sense for them anymore. And because of that, players like Marcus Davenport might end up being on the outs. So that's the way that we're looking at it. That's the way that I'm looking at it right now. We've got a couple of different ways to go about it, but that last one seems most likely for me as I look at his production over the course of his rookie contract. Coming up tomorrow, it's Thursday, so we got Crossover Thursday will be the early episode. Aaron Freeman and I breaking down everything you need to know around the Atlanta Falcons, New Orleans Saints game this weekend. And then in the afternoon or in the evening, we'll drop your future episode, which is going to be looking at another draft prospect breakdown. We did Hendon Hooker last week. Now let's talk about Will Levis, and we'll get to Max Duggan the week after that as well, around Christmas or maybe the week after Christmas, because I think I'm going to have to dial back the 2-a-days during the week of Christmas just because I'm visiting family and stuff like that. And so we'll probably dial back 2-a-days that week, but then get right back to them the week after that. So I appreciate you as always, y'all, for checking us out, making us your first listen of the day. Don't forget to go and check out Locked On Sports today as well, getting all of that local insight from the Locked On local experts around the entire world of sports. You can find that on this app, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. I appreciate you as always, making me part of your day, part of your routine, saying yes to me and the show. If you see me, say hi. If you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on Twitter at RawShaxon, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how family's doing. Let me know how you're living. Let me know how you're momming them. And trust you, that nation. I'll holla.